What's up, everyone? So today we have a question from Chris Haefner, who asks, if you didn't like working disputes, did they pay well? If you did the same thing for eBay, would they pay better? I'm going to take answering these questions back one at a time. To answer the first question about, did I like working on disputes? Not so much, but kind of. It was interesting seeing, both points of view, both the darknet vendor and the darknet buyer, stating their case. That said, most of the time it was like pretty stupid disputes. You would like see someone who, was like a first time buyer starting a dispute 2 to 3 days after, they had purchased on the market. Sometimes like the darknet vendor had yet to even mark the packages shipped. It was insightful to like take an active role in adjudicating these disputes. It made me a better darknet vendor by seeing the opinions, the thoughts, and the things that like made people aggravated as darknet market buyers to the point where they would initiate a dispute to begin with. That said, like, some of them were highly valid. Sometimes you would see people dispute, unbeknownst to them, the same vendor tens or hundreds of times a day or a week. This was because like that vendor was either selectively scamming or doing like his version of an exit scam. One of the things that blew my mind was, darknet vendors trying to do selective scamming or exit scamming, have an infinitely more difficult time doing this than darknet markets because of the collective peer review process on the darknet. Even if I had denied like all the disputes customers had raised against a particular darknet vendor, for example, like those people still would have been able to make reviews and post on the forums. As a result, even if I had tried to cover up a darknet vendor exit scamming or like, selective scamming, people still would have been made aware by this, like by the reviews by default because of the nature of just the review process, like on the darknet, the crowdsourced peer review process that exists. There's a massive upside to the darknet and, purchasing stuff there instead of buying them, in the street. If, for example, like a drug dealer laces his drugs with fent, like no one knows until that guy is indicted or, until half his customer base dies. On the darknet, this is clear before the end of the day. Like it's not always the darknet vendor who is in the wrong. I've seen buyers who have placed orders and, almost started a dispute the next day. Sometimes it's like, on hold for like when that happens, I'll put it on hold for like 7 to 14 days. I would lean towards denying the buyer's dispute because the inexperience of the darknet buyer, the like beauty of the system was that I was both a darknet vendor and a darknet buyer. So I never had any bias, like, one way or the other. I knew many darknet vendors and handled disputes for some of the vendors that I really respected and liked. In those dealings, I was consistently fair. Like you have to be, as like, you may like or respect someone on the darknet, and how like they handle business. Then a week later, they may exit scam or, start selective scamming. You never really know. Staying on point and paying attention is a necessity of life in that environment for survival. I would say that I didn't like disputes because they became extremely tedious. Like you're handling hundreds, maybe thousands. If they can be worked quickly, of those disputes, like daily, like you're going to end up doing them for 16 hours a day. There's no overtime. And at the end of the day, there's, the possibility that that market exit scams. And, if that happens, you're not going to be paid for all the hours you work. Just like the darknet vendors and the buyers, that use that market, you too are going to get screwed while, the high echelons of, individuals who created the darknet market, steal from everyone and, take off. It's a crappy feeling. Other times I would see someone complain that they, never got a package. The darknet vendor would, state that they have a tracking number for that person, and that if that individual continues to insist that, the package was never delivered to them, that they'll disclose the tracking number, to me as a darknet, market staff member to win the dispute. When this happens, the darknet vendor, supplied me with a tracking number to confirm that the package was shipped on the date it was marked shipped. The package was eventually delivered to the customer. Then the dispute would be closed in favor of the darknet vendor. That said, you also have, you have to remember that, like, at the end of the day, not all darknet vendors will, give you a refund or a reship, as it's, called. Like a reship is like basically where, the product that they shipped initially, they reship again at no cost to you. Like the darknet vendor will offer you a reship for your package, to you at their cost. Which I've done this a couple of times. My method was like, you can either have a 50% refund of your money, or I can do a reship of the exact same product to a different address. Like the choice was yours. Sometimes a package would just not make it. Like a neighbor steals the package or a postal employee steals it. And it's never marked as delivered. Typically, if your package is marked as delivered, you're not eligible for a reship or a refund, like, period. This is because many customers in the past have said that, someone stole it and, they got it and they just wanted another free shipment of that item or product. Like, so, when looking at and deciding on like a particular case involving disputes and the darknet, not only do you have to look at the timeline, like what the buyer says and what the vendor says, but you also have to look at the buyer's history and the vendor's history. Like, does the vendor have a short history? Does the buyer have a short history? What do they mention on the forums? Like, what's mentioned on other sites? Can you find any posts on the forums with the buyer's username? Like, do they, talk about ripping off vendors? Like, all these things are relevant to a decision. Not only that, but you also have to consider the darknet vendor's terms and conditions, that they state. For example, like, if a darknet vendor's terms and conditions state that, they don't issue refunds, nor do they give tracking numbers, or like, if they say that they shipped packages, with no tracking numbers, like, if you accept responsibility for packages never coming, you automatically lose the dispute by default, even if you never got your package. In that case, they have no obligation to prove that they shipped anything. The process, like, it gets really tedious and can be like, really time consuming. How I would go through it is I would review each case. If I couldn't decide within 45 seconds, I would move on to the next one. I would do 100 to like 900 disputes a day that were easy. The next day I would come back and analyze in depth, the other ones. The cool thing about, this job is that you get to know, both the vendors and the buyers, like, extremely well after about a month. You can tell instantly if someone is, disputing a particular vendor. That like that vendor is exit scamming or, selective scamming, like, on a particular website. When I could tell definitively that a darknet vendor was exit scamming or scamming people selectively on a particular darknet market, like, their account would be banned from that market instantly. Still, their profile would remain up on the site. It would state that, like, they were banned for selective or exit scamming their customers, and like, it would only take a very short amount of time before, like, that information found its way to various forums and, like, Dread or, any other place in the darknet. So like doing disputes paid exceptionally well. Any position on the darknet market, it pays very well, even if it's like a low ranking position. This is because like you're part of an active conspiracy. Like you should be paid exceptionally well. The risks like you're taking are pretty big. Even if you're doing something as arbitrary as disputes or public relations, you're still taking a risk by, being a darknet market staff member. However, the risk you're taking as a darknet market staff member pales in comparison to the risks that you're, taking as a darknet buyer, which can also pale in comparison to the risks that, darknet vendors are actively taking. Make no mistake about it. Like the number, like one goal for law enforcement is darknet vendors. So there's that. Yes, being on staff on the darknet market pays, considerably well compared to something like eBay. If, a darknet market paid individuals $15 or $20 an hour for their time, and effort, no one would ever work there because, they could go do the same thing at a legitimate job. I covered the pay rates of darknet markets pretty verbosely in my DEF CON talk. They vary significantly from like market to market. They're typically based on things what the staff at the top are willing to pay for good staff, if they're willing to pay at all, because sometimes the staff screw you over, just like they exit scam and screw everyone else over. And, it also depends on what kind of work you're going to do with them. The more technical the work, the more you can charge for it. I know individuals who would handle things like, technical security or information security for a given darknet, and they would make, 20 grand a week, and that was normal. At the end of the day, just like anything else, it depends on the job and like how complicated it is to do that job. It also depends on like who you are. There are a lot of variables, going into it. So absolutes are something you're not going to see. There is no standardization of pay rates like, you have in the job marketplace, of like the legit world. There's also no guarantee that you're going to get paid, as you have in the job marketplace or in like the legit world. So, if you guys like this video, make sure that, you hit that like button. It helps get the content out there. And hit that subscribe button and, make sure that you have the alerts turned on. So when I release new content, you get alerted to that. I hope that answers your question entirely. And I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video.